The story of Atitang Imbing Huminis begins not simply with her birth, but with the land that cradled her people. Sunglapa, Lapuyan, nestled within the mountains of Zamboanga del Sur, is a place of rolling hills, fertile valleys, and thick forests that stretch like an endless green sea. To the Subanen, this land was more than geography. It was the very heart of their identity. Every river carried a story. Every tree had a spirit, and every mountain bore witness to their ancestors' struggles and triumphs. The Subanen were known as People of the River, a name derived from Suba, meaning river, and their way of life reflected a harmonious relationship with the land. They planted corn, upland rice, and root crops, practiced swidden farming, and hunted in the forests. Their communities were small and scattered, tied together not by the rigidity of towns, but by kinship, customs, and the authority of their Thimuay, or chiefs. The world of Sunglapa was both remote and resilient. To outsiders, it seemed hidden, but to the Subanen, it was a sacred refuge where culture and tradition were protected against the encroaching tide of change sweeping through the Philippines in the early 20th century. Spanish influence had been felt for centuries along the coastal towns, yet the rugged interior had shielded the Subanen from full colonial assimilation. It was only in the American era that roads began to cut through the thick forests and missionaries began to arrive, carrying with them both faith and foreknowledge. For the Subanen, the mountains were not obstacles, but guardians, shaping their rhythms of life. Festivals tied to harvests, rituals performed in sacred groves, and epics sung beneath starlit skies. It was into this living world that Atitang would be born. Her life was destined to weave together the threads of tradition and modernity, of faith and culture. But to understand her journey, one must first understand the soil beneath her feet, the flowing rivers of her childhood, and the spirits of the mountains that whispered stories into the ears of the Subanen. For it was not merely a physical landscape, but a spiritual one, a land where the ancestors walked beside the living, and where the destiny of a princess was nurtured long before her first cry. The Subanen people, among the oldest tribal groups of Mindanao, had lived in harmony with their environment for generations. Their lives were governed not by written law, but by oral tradition, songs, chants, and stories passed from elder to youth. In Subanen culture, the Thimuay was both leader and mediator, balancing the needs of the community with the unseen world of spirits and ancestors. Rituals called buklog, elaborate ceremonies performed with sacred dancing and gongs, were central to community life. These were not mere performances, but living connections to the divine, asking for blessings in harvest, healing, or peace. Women played important roles as keepers of crafts and oral tradition, though leadership remained largely in the hands of male chieftains. Daily life was simple, yet deeply meaningful. A Subanen family's wealth was measured not in coins, but in fields planted, jars preserved, gongs inherited, and kinship ties strengthened. Children were taught respect for elders, for nature, and for the spirits that guarded the land. Young girls learned weaving and embroidery, often spending hours in the dlaman, an elevated room of the house where they practiced skills away from public view. Boys, on the other hand, were introduced to farming, hunting, and the responsibilities of kinship alliances. It was a world where every act carried significance, and every role reinforced the survival of the tribe. Yet, this traditional order was already under pressure by the early 1900s. Roads opened by Americans made Lapuyan more accessible, drawing traders and settlers into Subanen territory. Christian missions began to introduce new ideas of worship, morality, and education. Though change was inevitable, the Subanen spirit was resilient, seeking ways to adapt without losing its essence. It was in this climate of cultural negotiation that Atitang's story would unfold. A story of a girl born to inherit not only the privileges of leadership, but also the burdens of transformation. Before Atitang was born, her clan was already legendary among the Subanen. At the center of this legacy stood her grandfather, Thimuay Imbing, a chieftain whose name carried weight across the mountains of Zamboanga del Sur. Imbing was more than a political leader. He was a spiritual figure, a tribal priest whose authority rested on wisdom, bravery, and his role as custodian of Subanen traditions. His leadership was remembered not only for defending the tribe's autonomy, but also for opening their world to new encounters. When American missionaries arrived in 1912, it was Imbing they approached, knowing that the acceptance of the leader meant the acceptance of his people. His eventual conversion to Christianity marked a turning point in Subanen history, ushering in an era where biblical faith and tribal identity began to intertwine in complex ways. To his descendants, Imbing was both a patriarch and a symbol of destiny. He believed that leadership was not confined to men alone, and in his favorite granddaughter, he saw a spark that defied tradition. He broke with the custom of hiding daughters of chieftains in the Dlaman, instead allowing Atitang to roam freely, to ask questions, and to explore the world beyond the four walls of her home. This decision would shape her character profoundly, nurturing her spirit of curiosity, courage, and resilience. Legends about Thimuay Imbing painted him as a bridge builder between the old and the new, the ancestral and the foreign. He respected the ancient chants, yet listened to the hymns of missionaries. He valued kinship alliances, yet opened the way for formal education. In this sense, his granddaughter would inherit not only his bloodline, but also his vision. When she was born in 1919, the community whispered that the child of Thimuay Imbing and Nancy Laris carried the blessing of her grandfather's spirit. In time, these whispers would prove prophetic. The land had birthed a princess, but destiny was about to shape her into something greater, a jewel of the Subanen people, whose light would shine far beyond Sunglapa's mountains. On December 15th, 1919, the village of Sunglapa welcomed the birth of a child whose life would ripple across generations. She was named Atitang, the fifth child of Thimuay Imbing, a tribal priest, and Nancy Laris, a woman of grace and quiet strength. But what made her birth extraordinary was not merely her parentage. It was the web of history and faith that surrounded her. In an era when many Subanen births went unrecorded, hers was carefully written down, an unusual act that symbolized the merging of tribal tradition with the new influence of Christianity and literacy. The missionaries who had converted her grandfather, Thimuay Imbing, believed in keeping records, and thus her birthday, unlike that of most of her peers, was preserved for history. This act, small as it seemed, foreshadowed the preservationist role she herself would play later in life. From the very beginning, Atitang was considered a child of destiny. Being the granddaughter of the great Thimuay, Imbing placed her at the heart of Subanen leadership. The community watched her closely, for it was believed that the blood of chiefs carried within it a special calling, a weight of responsibility that could not be ignored. Yet even in her infancy, her life was marked by contrasts. She was nurtured within the old rhythms of Subanen life, songs, chants, and the secluded world of women's work, while also being touched by the winds of change blowing from the outside world, schools, churches, and foreign ways of thinking. Her birth brought joy to the clan, but it also carried expectations. Subanen daughters of leaders were traditionally kept out of sight, trained in silence and modesty. Their role was not to rule, but to embody grace, to weave fine embroidery, and to preserve rituals of womanhood. Yet, for Atitang, destiny had another path. Her grandfather saw in her a spark of restlessness, a brightness that could not be dimmed by tradition. He whispered to his closest kin that this child would not remain hidden. Her life would be one of visibility, of words, and of leadership. Thus, her journey began, as a princess born into a world standing at the crossroads of ancient heritage and modern transformation. In Subanen culture, daughters of chiefs were raised differently from ordinary girls. They were secluded in the dlamen, a mezzanine space above the family home. There, away from public view, they were taught to embroider, weave, and master the arts of domesticity that defined the quiet dignity of Subanen womanhood. The dlamen was both a place of honor and a cage of tradition, designed to preserve the purity and prestige of noble daughters. Girls spent their days under the watchful eyes of mothers and aunts, who passed down the skills, stories, and songs that sustained the tribe's cultural fabric. But for young Atitang, the dlamen could not contain her spirit. While she dutifully learned the art of embroidery, her heart longed to run outside, to feel the soil beneath her feet, and to hear the voices of the world beyond. Her curiosity often got the better of her, and she would sneak glances through the slats of the house to watch the bustle below. Farmers returning from the fields, elders discussing matters of kinship, and children playing by the riverbank. These glimpses fueled her imagination, making her restless under the constraints of tradition. Her grandfather, Thimuay Imbing, noticed this. Unlike many men of his generation, he was willing to question custom when he saw potential in the individual. He believed that Atitang should not be confined to embroidery alone. Instead, he allowed her more freedom than was customary. She could leave the dlamen to mingle with the missionaries, learn their ways, and ask questions that other girls might never dare to voice. This act of leniency was revolutionary in its own quiet way, setting the stage for Atitang to break barriers throughout her life. The dlamen still shaped her, however. It gave her patience, precision, and an appreciation for detail, qualities that would later serve her in translation work and cultural preservation. It was as if destiny had blended tradition and innovation within her, crafting a character both rooted and restless. While many Subanen girls remained hidden, Atitang's spirit was already pushing her toward the light, foreshadowing the trailblazing role she would later embrace. The relationship between Atitang and her grandfather, the legendary Thimuay Imbing, was pivotal in her development. To the Subanen, the words and actions of a chief were not taken lightly. They carried the weight of tradition and the authority of ancestral spirits. Imbing, who had led his people through the turbulent encounter with American missionaries, saw in his granddaughter a unique destiny. While others might have treated her as simply another child in a large family, he singled her out as his favorite, believing she would carry forward a legacy greater than that of embroidery and seclusion. He often spoke of a vision, that the Subanen needed leaders who could bridge the gap between their ancient traditions and the rapidly changing world. The roads being carved into their mountains, the schools being built in nearby towns, and the churches rising in the valleys were signals that the world was shifting. If the Subanen were to endure, they would need someone who could speak both languages, the tongue of their ancestors and the tongue of the modern world. Imbing believed Atitang was that person. His trust in her went against convention. Many elders raised eyebrows, questioning why the chief would favor a granddaughter over grandsons or nephews. But Imbing stood firm. He saw in her not only intelligence, but also resilience, a capacity to absorb new ideas without losing her cultural essence. He encouraged her to interact with missionaries, to listen to their teachings, and to learn their language. He opened doors for her education, a rare opportunity for Subanen girls of that era. This vision planted the seeds of her destiny. Atitang would not only inherit her people's traditions, but also carry them into a broader stage through education, translation, and leadership. Her grandfather's foresight gave her the courage to step into spaces where women of her tribe had never been allowed before. And though she was still a child, the whispers of prophecy already surrounded her. She was not destined to remain hidden in the Dlaman. Instead, she would become a light, a jewel whose brilliance would illuminate the path for her people. By the early 1900s, the Philippines had entered a new era. After centuries of Spanish rule, the Americans had arrived, bringing with them a different style of governance, infrastructure projects, and, most influential of all for the Subanen, the presence of Protestant missionaries. Unlike the Spaniards, who had largely focused on lowland and coastal settlements, the Americans ventured deeper into the interior, reaching tribal groups who had remained relatively untouched by colonial Christianity. In 1912, their journey brought them to the mountains of Lapuyan, where they encountered the Subanen chieftain Thimuay Imbing. The arrival of the missionaries was a turning point. They did not come as conquerors with soldiers, but as evangelists with Bibles, hymnals, and a vision of education. They spoke of a faith rooted not in ritual sacrifice, but in the teachings of Christ. For many Subanen, the idea of worshiping through prayer and song rather than elaborate ceremonies was foreign, yet strangely appealing. The missionaries introduced reading, writing, and record-keeping, tools that would later empower Subanen leaders to preserve their culture in unexpected ways. Imbing, wise and discerning, listened carefully. He recognized that rejecting these new influences outright would isolate his people in a world that was quickly changing. At the same time, he was cautious, ensuring that Subanen traditions were not simply erased. His eventual decision to embrace biblical Christianity was both practical and visionary. Practical, because it aligned his tribe with a rising American presence in Mindanao, securing access to education and resources. Visionary, because it opened new possibilities for his people, particularly the younger generation, who could now gain literacy and bridge the gap between tribal isolation and national identity. It was within this historical current that Atitang would grow up. By the time of her birth in 1919, the missionary influence was already strong in her clan. She was among the first Subanen children whose life was documented on paper, whose songs included not only ancient chants, but also hymns in English, and whose education would not be limited to the oral traditions of her ancestors. The missionaries had brought winds of change into the mountains. In the heart of this windstorm stood a young girl destined to embody the merging of two worlds. The conversion of the Imbing clan did not happen overnight. For generations, the Subanen had lived by their ancestral faith, rooted in animistic beliefs and rituals that honored the spirits of the land. Every illness was believed to be caused by unseen forces. Every harvest was tied to the goodwill of ancestral guardians, and every community event was accompanied by chants and dances that connected the living with the spiritual. To abandon these practices was no small matter. It was to risk losing one's identity, one's relationship with the unseen, and one's sense of continuity with the past. Yet, under the guidance of Thimuay Imbing, the clans slowly opened themselves to Christianity. Imbing himself was baptized, a moment that reverberated through Subanen society. If the chief embraced the new faith, the people would follow. Soon, hymn singing replaced some of the old chants, prayers replaced ritual offerings, and the Bible began to be read in gatherings. The transition was not without conflict. Some elders feared that abandoning traditional rituals would bring misfortune. Others worried that the spirits of their ancestors would be angered. But over time, the blending of Christianity with Subanen resilience, created a new cultural identity, one that was uniquely theirs. For the younger generation, Christianity came hand in hand with education. Missionaries insisted that literacy was essential for understanding the scriptures, and so children were taught to read and write. For Subanen girls, this was revolutionary. Traditionally confined to domestic roles, they were now given the chance to learn, to sing hymns, and to participate in a faith that valued their voices. Among these young learners, Atitang stood out. Her eagerness to learn hymns, recite verses, and master the English language marked her as different. Where others saw schooling as a novelty, she embraced it as destiny. This religious transformation did not erase Subanen culture, but it reframed it. The bucklog ceremonies continued in some communities, though modified with Christian prayers. Ancestral stories were still told, but now alongside biblical parables. Atitang grew up in this dual world, where the sacred river of tradition met the flowing stream of Christianity. She would become a living example of this merger, able to recite both a Subanen epic and a hymn with equal passion. The clan's conversion was not just about faith. It was about survival, adaptation, and creating space for their children to thrive in a world that was rapidly changing. For the Subanen, the world beyond their mountains was both mysterious and intimidating. The coastal towns of Zamboanga del Sur bustled with settlers, traders, and officials. Roads were slowly cutting through the rugged terrain, connecting once isolated villages to markets and schools. The American government was pushing for integration, encouraging tribal groups to participate in civic life, and missionaries were ensuring that education became the bridge between the mountains and the towns. As a child, Atitang would often hear stories about these changes from visiting relatives or passing traders. She learned that in the coastal towns, people wore Western clothes, sent their children to formal schools, and spoke languages unfamiliar to her ears. For the Subanen, venturing beyond their mountains meant facing prejudice and misunderstanding. Lowlanders often looked down upon upland tribes, calling them backward or uncivilized. Yet, within these spaces also lay opportunity, access to education, healthcare, and wider recognition. Atitang's family was in a unique position to navigate this balance. With their ties to the missionaries, they were able to step into the world of formal schooling, learning English and adapting to modern ways without abandoning their tribal identity. Her grandfather's vision had prepared them for this journey, but it was still a challenge. For every hymn she learned, there was also an epic chant she needed to remember. For every English word she mastered, there was a Subanen phrase that risked being forgotten. This tension between the mountains and the coast, the traditional and the modern, would shape her destiny. While many Subanen girls remained confined within the walls of the Dlaman, Atitang's world was expanding rapidly. She could no longer be just a daughter of the tribe. She was becoming a child of two civilizations. This duality would later define her life's work as a translator, cultural preserver, and leader. The winds of change were blowing stronger, carrying her from the quiet rivers of Sunglapa toward the broader currents of history. From an early age, Atitang's hunger for knowledge revealed itself in ways that set her apart from other children in her village. While many Subanen girls were expected to stay close to home, learning embroidery or helping in household tasks, she was drawn toward the world of the missionaries who lived nearby. The missionaries' home, with its books, songs, and the strange rhythm of the English tongue, became for her a place of fascination. She would run there almost daily, offering to wash dishes, sweep floors, or do simple chores in exchange for the chance to listen to lessons. To some, this eagerness seemed unusual, even unseemly for a young Subanen girl of noble blood. But to her, it was as natural as breathing. She craved words, stories, and songs, and she would gladly work to earn them. Her family would often tease her, saying she had already been adopted by the missionaries. This teasing, though light-hearted, reflected the unusual nature of her pursuit. It was rare for a Subanen child, especially a girl of her status, to so openly embrace the teachings of foreigners. Yet Atitang was not abandoning her people. She was equipping herself with tools that could later serve them. Her grandfather, ever watchful, encouraged her curiosity, knowing that the ability to understand English and read the scriptures would give her a role of great importance in the years to come. In those visits, she learned not only language, but also music. Hymns filled her mind, and she quickly mastered their melodies. She also learned crochet and simple arithmetic, expanding her skills beyond what traditional Subanen training could offer. Each day she returned home, her eyes shining with excitement, eager to share what she had learned. Slowly, she began to stand out among her peers, not simply as the granddaughter of a great chief, but as a young girl whose destiny was being shaped by education. These daily journeys to the missionary house were more than acts of learning. They were acts of crossing boundaries. Each step away from her home and toward the missionaries was a step toward bridging two worlds. She was still firmly Subanen, tied to her heritage and traditions, but her mind was opening to the possibilities of another world, a world of books, faith, and leadership. It was in this liminal space between tradition and change that her future as a trailblazer began to take shape, that Atitang's brilliance soon found its first formal outlet in the classroom. When public education was introduced to Lapuyan, she was among the few Subanen children permitted to attend. Many families hesitated to send their children, fearing that schooling might distance them from tradition. But for Atitang, it was an opportunity that could not be ignored. Under the guidance of Mr. Antonio Apostle, the first Subanen teacher, she flourished. Apostle himself was a symbol of possibility, a Subanen who had embraced education and returned to uplift his own people. In him, Atitang saw both a mentor and a mirror of what she herself might become. Her progress was astonishing. While most children moved slowly through the grades, she advanced at an incredible pace. In just 3 years, she completed 5 years of schooling, mastering subjects with a speed that impressed both her teachers and her peers. She had an extraordinary memory, a sharp mind for languages, and a natural eloquence that made her stand out. In recitations, she spoke with confidence. In music, her voice carried both the discipline of hymn singing and the lilting rhythm of Subanen chants. Teachers often remarked that she absorbed lessons like a sponge, and that her thirst for knowledge seemed insatiable. At home, her family marveled at her progress, though not without some concern. Education was a double-edged sword. While it brought opportunities, it also carried the risk of separating her from her people's ways. Yet because of her lineage and her grandfather's vision, her education was tolerated, even encouraged, more than that of other Subanen girls. Apostle himself nurtured her talent, sometimes giving her extra assignments or encouraging her to write short compositions. These exercises would later bear fruit in her life's work as a translator and composer of hymns. Education under Apostle did more than sharpen her mind. It gave her a sense of destiny. She began to realize that knowledge could be a weapon, not for war, but for preservation. With it, she could protect her people's language, translate their stories, and bridge the gap between their oral traditions and the written world. This realization planted in her the seeds of a lifelong mission to ensure that the Subanen voice would never be lost in the tide of history. As her education advanced, Atitang's path led her to the town of Margo Satubig, where she studied under another influential teacher, Mr. Ozeta. There, she continued to excel, earning the highest grades and outshining even the lowland children who had long been accustomed to formal schooling. Her achievements culminated in her graduation, where she was named valedictorian. For a Subanen girl, this was nothing short of groundbreaking. Her family and tribe rejoiced, for she had proven that their people were no less capable than others, and that their daughters, too, could shine in the world of letters. Yet, even as doors of opportunity opened, tradition pulled her back. Her dream was to become a nurse, a profession she believed would allow her to serve both her people and the wider world. She was even offered a government scholarship, an extraordinary chance for someone of her background. But her family hesitated. Accepting a scholarship meant owing a debt to the government, and for a tribal princess, that was considered unacceptable. They did not want her bound by obligations to outsiders, nor did they want her dignity as the granddaughter of a chief to be compromised by dependence on state generosity. The decision was heartbreaking for Atitang. She had worked hard, excelled beyond expectations, and proven her worth, only to be held back by tradition. But she did not allow disappointment to crush her spirit. Instead, she redirected her ambitions toward another path, the path opened by the missionaries who had nurtured her education from the beginning. If she could not serve as a nurse, she would serve as a teacher, a translator, a bearer of words and culture. This redirection was not a defeat, but a transformation, guiding her toward her life's true calling. Looking back, one can see how fate shaped her journey. Had she pursued nursing, she might have saved lives in hospitals, but lost the chance to save her people's heritage. By denying her the scholarship, her family unknowingly ensured that her talents would remain devoted to the Subanen. It was a sacrifice that turned into a blessing, setting her firmly on the path that would make her not only a cultural preserver, but also a spiritual leader. In this way, the tension between ambition and tradition gave birth to her destiny, preparing her for the greater work that lay ahead. In 1934, when most Subanen women were still bound by the traditions of the Dlaman and confined to domestic roles, Atitang took a bold step that would forever mark her as a pioneer. She left the familiar mountains of Lapuyan for the distant shores of Zamboanga City, embarking on a 2-day boat journey across restless waters to enroll at Ebenezer Bible Institute. For a Subanen woman, this was unprecedented. Few of her people, male or female, had traveled so far for education, and fewer still had pursued formal training in theology and ministry. The voyage itself symbolized the crossing of boundaries. On deck, she felt the wind against her face and the spray of salt water on her skin, both exhilarating and frightening. Behind her lay Sunglapa, the ancestral home that had nurtured her. Ahead lay the bustling port of Zamboanga, a place alive with traders, missionaries, soldiers, and settlers from all corners of the Philippines and beyond. For a young woman raised in the relative seclusion of the mountains, the city was a dizzying spectacle. Yet, she carried within her the calm assurance of her grandfather's vision, that she was destined to bridge two worlds. At Ebenezer, she entered an environment where the focus was not just on knowledge, but also on spiritual discipline. Classes covered scripture, theology, preaching, and the fundamentals of Christian service. The missionaries who taught there quickly recognized her brilliance. Her fluency in English allowed her to absorb lessons with ease, while her natural eloquence made her stand out among her peers. In a community where Subanen voices were often marginalized, hers rang clear and strong. Her enrollment was also symbolic for her tribe. The Subanen were often perceived by outsiders as a people without writing, without books, and without higher learning. Yet here was one of their daughters excelling in a Bible school, mastering texts that were foreign, yet transforming them into tools for her own people's survival. Each page she read, each hymn she sang, each prayer she whispered was not only for herself, but for the community that had entrusted her with this extraordinary opportunity. The years she spent at Ebenezer would be formative. They did not strip her of her Subanen identity. Rather, they gave her the tools to amplify it. She began to envision a future where the Word of God could be spoken in the rhythm of Subanen chants, where the scriptures could be read in her people's own tongue, and where women like her could stand as leaders in both faith and culture. By 1936, Atitang had completed her studies at Ebenezer Bible Institute, making history as one of the first 3 Subanen women ever to graduate from school. Her achievement was not merely academic. It was cultural and spiritual, a breaking of barriers that had long confined Subanen women to silence in public spaces. At her graduation, she did something extraordinary. She sang a song of her own composition. This was not just a performance, but a declaration. Through her music, she expressed gratitude, faith, and hope, weaving together Christian themes with the cadence of her people's oral tradition. Her song captured the attention of those present. Missionaries admired her creativity and her command of English. Her fellow Subanen were proud to see their culture represented in such a dignified manner. For Atitang, the act of singing her own composition at graduation symbolized her emerging identity as a cultural bridge. She was not simply repeating the lessons she had been taught. She was making them her own, transforming them into a form of expression uniquely Subanen. The significance of her graduation cannot be overstated. In a time when most Subanen girls were expected to marry early and live quiet lives in their villages, she had stepped onto a platform of leadership and visibility. She had proven that Subanen women could excel in formal education, that they could speak and sing in public, and that they could shape the direction of their people's future. Her graduation was a moment of triumph, not just for her, but for every Subanen woman whose potential had been stifled by tradition. Beyond the celebration, however, lay responsibility. Her education had equipped her not only with knowledge, but with a mission. She returned to her people with a sense of duty, knowing that her learning was not for herself alone, but for the community that had supported her journey. The songs she sang, the scriptures she studied, and the lessons she mastered were now tools for service. She had crossed the waters to Zamboanga and returned with gifts of wisdom and faith, ready to plant seeds of transformation in the soil of Sunglapa. After her graduation, Atitang's life took on a new role of service, this time within the political and cultural leadership of her tribe. Her uncle, Dato Lemek Imbing, had succeeded her grandfather as chieftain, and he relied on her talents in a way few chiefs had ever relied on a woman before. With her command of English, her eloquence in speech, and her ability to navigate both tribal and missionary worlds, she became his translator and official hostess. This role placed her at the very center of Subanen leadership. When government officials, missionaries, or scholars visited Lapuyan, it was often Atitang who welcomed them, translated their words, and ensured that communication flowed smoothly. In a society where women were traditionally kept in the background, she stood at the forefront, greeting leaders and dignitaries with grace and confidence. Her presence alone challenged the stereotype of the silent tribal woman, demonstrating instead that Subanen women could be articulate, knowledgeable, and authoritative. As hostess, she also became a cultural ambassador. She explained Subanen customs to outsiders, defended the dignity of her people, and corrected misconceptions. Many lowlanders viewed the Subanen as primitive or backward, but through her words and demeanor, Atitang showed that her people were rich in tradition, wisdom, and resilience. Her ability to translate not just language, but also culture made her indispensable. She was in many ways, the voice of her tribe to the outside world. This experience deepened her sense of responsibility. She realized that her education and eloquence were not mere personal achievements. They were tools of survival for her people in a rapidly modernizing world. She carried the weight of representation, knowing that how she spoke, acted, and even dressed could shape how outsiders perceive the Subanen. It was a heavy burden for a young woman, yet she bore it with dignity. In this role, Atitang began to embody the dual nature of her destiny. She was both a daughter of tradition and a trailblazer of change. She poured tea for visiting dignitaries, but she also translated the complexities of Subanen life. She sang hymns, but she also remembered epics. She stood in the space between cultures, holding them together with her words, her presence, and her vision. It was the beginning of a lifetime of bridging worlds, a role that would define her legacy as a jewel of the Subanen. As Atitang grew into womanhood, her reputation as a woman of learning and eloquence spread beyond the Subanen hills of Lapuyan. She was admired not only for her intelligence, but also for her grace, her ability to hold her own in gatherings where women were usually silent. It was during this season of her life that she crossed paths with a man whose destiny would intertwine with hers, Thimuay Libun Huminis. A respected leader, Huminis embodied the strength of Subanen manhood, wise in counsel, firm in decision, yet deeply committed to the welfare of his people. Their meeting was not a chance encounter, but part of the intricate web of kinship and tribal alliances that structured Subanen society. Among the Subanen, marriage was more than a union between two individuals. It was a binding of families, clans, and, in the case of chiefs, even communities. The prospect of a union between Atitang and Huminis was greeted with excitement, for it promised to strengthen ties between two influential bloodlines. Yet, what made their union special was not only its political significance, but also the respect and admiration they held for one another. Huminis was drawn to Atitang's intelligence and her unusual role as a public figure. Unlike many men of his generation, he did not view her learning as a threat, but as a gift. He recognized that her voice could complement his leadership, giving their people a stronger position in a world where they often felt overlooked by lowland politicians and coastal elites. For her part, Atitang admired his strength and wisdom, but above all, his willingness to see her not as a woman to be hidden, but as a partner to be heard. Their relationship blossomed against the backdrop of cultural change. The missionaries had planted the seeds of new values, and education had opened new possibilities. Yet at the core, their union remained rooted in Subanen traditions of kinship, respect, and shared responsibility. When Atitang and Huminis came together, it was as though two rivers merged, one carrying the waters of tradition, the other the currents of progress. Together, they would shape not only their family, but also the destiny of their community. The wedding of Atitang Imbing and Thimuay Libun Huminis was more than a personal milestone. It was a cultural and political event that brought together families, clans, and neighboring communities. Among the Subanen, weddings carried immense significance, for they symbolized the continuation of kinship ties, the honoring of ancestral spirits, and the strengthening of social bonds. The celebration lasted for days, filled with music, feasting, and ritual blessings. Gongs echoed through the mountains, and dancers performed the traditional bucklog, their rhythmic steps calling upon the spirits to bless the union. At the heart of the ceremony was the affirmation of roles. As a Thimuay Libun, Huminis was already a leader whose voice carried weight in tribal councils. By marrying him, Atitang stepped into a new role that combined tradition with innovation. Traditionally, wives of chiefs were expected to remain supportive yet unseen, their influence exercised quietly behind the scenes. But for Atitang, this was never an option. Her education, her eloquence, and her grandfather's vision had already positioned her as a public figure. Even in the rituals of her wedding, there was a sense that she was not merely a passive bride, but an active partner in the shaping of Subanen leadership. Guests at the wedding noted her poise and confidence. She carried herself not as a timid young woman, but as someone aware of her destiny. Her words of gratitude to her family and community were eloquent, blending humility with strength. Her voice, clear and resonant, echoed the hymn she had learned at Ebenezer while still honoring the chants of her ancestors. For many Subanen women, her presence at the center of such an important event was a source of inspiration, showing that it was possible to be both traditional and modern, faithful and pioneering. The union between Atitang and Huminis also symbolized a deeper merging of paths. He embodied political strength and tribal authority. She carried cultural wisdom and spiritual vision. Together, they would become not just a married couple, but a team, leading their people through a period of rapid change. Their wedding was celebrated not only as a personal joy, but also as a collective hope, that in their union, the Subanen would find strength, resilience, and a path forward in the shifting landscape of Mindanao. Marriage to Thimuay Libun Huminis carried responsibilities far beyond the walls of their home. In time, Huminis rose not only as supreme Subanen chieftain, but also as mayor of Lapuyan, a position that placed him at the intersection of tribal leadership and municipal governance. As his wife, Atitang assumed a new role, one that blended the traditional responsibilities of a chieftain spouse with the modern expectations of a political first lady. It was a role she embraced wholeheartedly, carving out a space for herself in a world where women's voices were still often dismissed. As Lapuyan's first lady, she was deeply involved in community life. She organized gatherings, led women's initiatives, and supported projects that improved the welfare of families. She encouraged education for children, especially girls, arguing that the future of the Subanen depended on giving their daughters the same opportunities their sons enjoyed. Her involvement went far beyond the ceremonial. She was a driving force in planning and implementing programs, using her influence to mobilize resources and inspire participation. Her leadership challenged conventions. In a society where women were expected to remain in the background, she stood at the forefront, addressing crowds, welcoming visitors, and speaking on behalf of her people. She became known for her eloquence, her ability to translate not only between languages, but also between cultures. When officials visited, she ensured they understood the dignity and depth of Subanen traditions. When missionaries arrived, she explained how faith was being lived out in her community. Her role as translator and hostess expanded into that of leader and advocate. Lapuyan flourished under this partnership of leadership. The combination of Huminis' authority as a chief and Atitang's vision as a cultural ambassador gave the Subanen a unique position in Mindanao. They were no longer passive participants in history, but active shapers of their destiny. Through her work, Atitang showed that leadership was not confined to men, nor was it limited to political office. True leadership, she demonstrated, was about service, vision, and the courage to stand in the gap between tradition and change. In becoming Lapuyan's First Lady, Atitang transformed expectations for Subanen women. She was no longer just the granddaughter of a chief or the wife of a leader. She was a leader in her own right, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband, shaping the future of her people. Among all her life's works, few were as monumental as Atitang's contribution to the translation of the New Testament into the Subanen language. For generations, The Subanen people had relied on oral traditions to preserve their epics, chants, and prayers. The written word was foreign, often seen as belonging to outsiders. First the Spaniards with their colonial decrees, then the Americans with their textbooks and Bibles in English. But Atitang believed that the scriptures, if truly to take root among her people, had to be rendered in their own tongue. Faith, she argued, should not be something borrowed or translated only by outsiders. It had to live in the heartbeat of the Subanen language itself. Her work on the translation was arduous and deeply personal. She was not merely converting words from one language to another. She was bridging worldviews. Every verse of the New Testament had to be carefully examined, weighed, and expressed in a way that captured both meaning and rhythm. Biblical imagery, often drawn from Middle Eastern landscapes, had to be reimagined for a people whose world was rivers, mountains, and forests. A shepherd leading sheep, for example, resonated differently with a community more familiar with farming and swidden cultivation. Atitang, with her intimate knowledge of both scripture and Subanen culture, navigated these challenges with wisdom. Her translation work was not solitary. She collaborated with missionaries, scholars, and members of her own community, ensuring accuracy while maintaining cultural authenticity. Yet her role was unique. As a Subanen woman fluent in English, she carried insights that no outsider could replicate. She knew instinctively which words would resonate and which might feel foreign or hollow. She labored over every passage, often revisiting her work to refine it until the cadence of Subanen speech aligned with the sacredness of the text. By 1982, the project reached its climax with the launch of Su Begashamaya, the Subanen New Testament. 4 years later, it was published by the Philippine Bible Society, marking a historic moment for her people. Atitang had personally translated 24 of the 27 books, a staggering feat that placed her among the foremost cultural and spiritual pioneers of her time. Through this work, she gave her people not just access to Scripture, but ownership of it, ensuring that their voices could rise in prayer and song in their own language. It was a triumph of faith, culture, and perseverance, a true jewel in her life's crown. If Scripture was the backbone of Subanen Christianity, then hymns were its heartbeat. Music had always been central to Subanen culture, woven into their rituals, stories, and communal life. From the solemn chants of the Buklog to the melodic flow of epic recitations, the Subanen understood that words set to rhythm carried power. Power to remember, to heal, and to bind communities together. Atitang, with her gift for music and translation, recognized that for Christianity to truly resonate with her people, hymns had to be sung not only in English or Tagalog, but in the Subanen tongue. Her efforts bore fruit in the 1962 publication of Su Na Babat Nu Na Pejanugut, Hymns of the Christian Life. This collection contained over 200 hymns, painstakingly translated and adapted by Atitang herself. The task was no simple matter. Translating hymns required not only linguistic skill, but also a musician's ear, for every line had to match existing melodies. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the Subanen versions preserved the theological depth of the originals, while flowing naturally in her people's language. The hymns became a cornerstone of worship in Subanen churches. For the first time, congregations could lift their voices in song without struggling with foreign words. Hymns like Amazing Grace or What a Friend We Have in Jesus, once distant in English, became intimate prayers when sung in Subanen. Elders who could not read English now joined freely in worship, their voices carrying the familiar rhythms of their language. Children, too, grew up with hymns that sounded like home, ensuring that their faith was not divorced from their identity. Atitang's hymn book also had cultural significance. It validated the Subanen language as worthy of preservation and use in sacred spaces. In a time when many indigenous tongues were being eroded by Tagalog and English, the hymns offered a lifeline, proving that Subanen was not a language of the past, but of the present and the future. Every note sung in Subanen was a declaration. We are here, our faith is alive, and our language is holy. The hymn book spread far beyond Lapuyan. Churches in neighboring provinces adopted it, and missionaries marveled at the seamless integration of Western melodies with indigenous language. For Atitang, the hymns were more than songs. They were bridges between her people and God, between the past and the future, between tradition and faith. While her translations of the Bible and hymns were groundbreaking, Atitang's work extended even further into the realm of cultural preservation. In the 1980s, she turned her attention to an unlikely medium, comic books. Missionaries and Christian publishers were experimenting with illustrated biblical stories as tools for teaching, especially among young readers. Recognizing their potential, Atitang volunteered to translate several of these comics into Subanen. Her goal was simple yet profound: to make the stories of Scripture accessible in a format that was both engaging and familiar. The translation of comic books may seem a small task compared to the Bible or hymns, but for Atitang, no effort was too small if it brought faith closer to her people. She worked line by line, ensuring that the dialogues of biblical characters flowed naturally in Subanen speech. She wanted children and youth to see their own language in print, to recognize that their words, too, could carry sacred stories. By doing so, she not only spread the Christian message, but also elevated Subanen as a written language worthy of publication. At the same time, she poured herself into the preservation of Subanen epics, those long chants that have been passed down orally for centuries. She recognized that without documentation, these treasures risked being lost in the tide of modernization. Her most famous work was the transcription and translation of Dlamambe Pagaslungan, an epic so vast it took 8 hours to chant, longer than both the Mahabharata and the Iliad. Her recordings and written transcriptions of this and other epics became invaluable resources for scholars like Dr. Ernesto Constantino, who praise her dedication to safeguarding oral literature. Among the treasures of Subanen culture are its epics, long, poetic chants that recount the deeds of heroes, the struggles of ancestors, and the sacred origins of their people. These epics were never written down in the old days. They lived in memory, passed from one chanter to the next, and performed during rituals or gatherings that sometimes lasted through the night. By the late 20th century, however, modernization threatened their survival. Radios, televisions, and new forms of entertainment distracted the youth, while older chanters began to pass away without apprentices to continue their craft. It was in this critical moment that Atitang stepped forward as both preserver and translator, ensuring that her people's oral literature would not fade into silence. Her most significant project was the recording and transcription of Dlamambe Pagaslungan, one of the grandest Subanen epics. Lasting 8 full hours when chanted in its entirety, it surpassed in length even the most celebrated works of world literature, longer than the Mahabharata of India and the Iliad of Greece. But unlike those epics, which had long been available in written form, Dlamambe Pagaslungan was fragile, existing only in the memory of elders. Atitang understood that to preserve it, she had to act swiftly. With the help of recording equipment provided by scholars and missionaries, she captured the voices of Subanen chanters, their melodies rising and falling with the rhythm of ancient verse. Transcribing the epic into written Subanen was a monumental task. The language of the chant was archaic, filled with metaphors, idioms, and ritual phrases rarely used in everyday speech. Atitang painstakingly listened, rewound, and replayed the recordings, matching sounds to words, ensuring accuracy while preserving the beauty of the original cadence. She then translated portions into English, allowing scholars and cultural archivists to appreciate the depth of Subanen oral tradition. Her work was praised by linguists like Dr. Ernesto Constantino, who recognized its scholarly value and cultural importance. Through this effort, Atitang ensured that Dlamini Pagaslungan would survive not only in memory, but also in written form, accessible to future generations. She had saved a river of words from drying up, capturing it in books and recordings that would outlive the elders who had once carried it in their voices. In doing so, she proved that cultural preservation was as sacred a calling as translation of Scripture. Both were acts of honoring the Word, whether divine or ancestral. Atitang's work did not stop with Dlamini Pagaslungan. She also turned her attention to other epics, among them Djembatitu, a narrative equally rich in symbolism and cultural memory. These works were not merely stories for entertainment. They were vessels of identity, encoding moral lessons, historical memory, and spiritual wisdom within their verses. For the Subanen, to lose these epics was to lose a vital part of who they were. Atitang, fully aware of this, dedicated her energy to documenting as many as possible. The transcription and translation of Djembatitu brought her into close collaboration with scholars from institutions such as Xavier University. Antonio Enriquez and his wife Joy Viernes Enriquez, both cultural documentarians, worked with her to record and archive these precious texts. They recognized in Atitang not just an informant, but a colleague, a cultural authority in her own right. Her fluency in English allowed her to communicate effectively with academics, while her deep roots in Subanen life gave her credibility among local chanters and elders. She was the bridge through which oral tradition could pass into the written record without distortion. Her translations were meticulous. She did not settle for word-for-word equivalents, but sought to capture the essence of Subanen poetry. Repetition, rhythm, and imagery were preserved, allowing readers to experience something of the grandeur of the original chant. At the same time, her explanatory notes provided context for cultural references that outsiders might not understand. She described the symbolic meaning of rituals, the significance of certain landscapes, and the ancestral values embedded in the narrative. In this way, her work became not just a translation, but a cultural commentary, guiding both Subanen youth and non-Subanen scholars into the depths of her people's heritage. The archiving of Djembatitu and other epics marked a crucial step in protecting Subanen identity. Atitang knew that without such efforts, modernization would erode the memory of these stories. Young people, drawn to radios and schools, might never again sit for hours listening to the chants of elders. But with their transcriptions, they could one day rediscover their heritage, reading the words of their ancestors in both Subanen and English. By working with scholars, she ensured that her people's voice would not only survive, but also find recognition in the broader narrative of Philippine cultural history. Preservation, for Atitang, was not confined to words on a page. She envisioned her home itself as a sanctuary of culture, a place where the tangible heritage of the Subanen could be gathered, displayed, and celebrated. Over the years, she collected artifacts, woven fabrics, jars, brass gongs, embroidered garments, and ritual instruments, each carrying with it a story of the tribe's past. These items were not stored away as curiosities. They were displayed openly, transforming her home into what visitors described as a living museum. Researchers, missionaries, and cultural workers often visited her house in Lapuyan, drawn by her reputation as a guardian of Subanen knowledge. They found in her not only a host, but a teacher. She explained the function of each artifact, the significance of each design, and the rituals in which they were used. For young Subanen, her home became a place of discovery, where they could reconnect with traditions that modernization had begun to erode. She believed that artifacts were not dead relics, but living reminders of identity, anchors that tied the present to the past. Her dream extended beyond her own home. She advocated for the creation of a Subanen Heritage Museum, a permanent institution that could house the treasures of her people. With the support of organizations such as the Hidden Jewel of Mindanao Foundation and the Gumpungan Foundation, she began laying the groundwork for this vision. Though she would not live to see its full realization, her efforts inspired others to continue the work, ensuring that Subanen culture would be preserved for future generations. The living museum of her home symbolized her holistic approach to preservation. Words, songs, chants, artifacts, all were parts of the same tapestry of culture. She did not see faith and heritage as opposing forces, but as complementary, both deserving of respect and preservation. By opening her home to the world, she showed that the Subanen had nothing to hide and everything to share. Her living museum stood as a testament to her conviction that culture, like faith, must be embodied, remembered, and passed on. In the mid-1960s, when the Parent-Teacher Association, PDA, movement was taking root across the Philippines, few could have imagined that a Subanen woman would rise to lead such an organization in Lapuyan. Atitang Imbing Huminis, however, broke that expectation. In 1965, she was elected president of the PDA, a role that positioned her as a key figure in shaping the education of children, both Subanen and non-Subanen, in her community. For nearly a decade, until 1974, she held this position, making history as the first woman in her region to lead the association. Her leadership was transformative. She saw education not just as a tool for literacy, but as a path to dignity for her people. Under her presidency, she worked tirelessly to improve school facilities, organize fundraising events, and encourage parents to take an active role in their children's learning. She believed that schools were not only for children, but also for parents, who had to be engaged in shaping the moral and educational environment of the next generation. This was especially significant for Subanen parents, many of whom had little experience with formal education. Atitang became a bridge once again. She reassured hesitant Subanen families that sending their children to school would not erase their identity, but strengthen it. She encouraged teachers, many of them outsiders, to respect Subanen culture and adapt their methods to the local context. She organized community meetings where concerns could be voiced, creating a collaborative environment where parents and educators work together for the good of the children. Her tenure as PDA president challenged stereotypes about women's roles. At a time when many women were expected to remain within the domestic sphere, she stood as a public leader, presiding over meetings, making speeches, and negotiating with officials. Her example inspired other women to step forward into leadership roles, proving that Subanen women could contribute not only in homes and churches, but also in schools and civic institutions. For 9 years, she used her position to strengthen the educational foundation of Lapuyan. Her presidency was not just about managing schools. It was about planting seeds of confidence in her people, that they too could be equals in the nation's broader educational system. She was a woman of firsts, but she ensured she would not be the last. After her successful tenure in the PDA, Atitang continued to expand her leadership into other areas of community life. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, she turned her attention to the elderly recognizing that the wisdom of senior citizens was often overlooked in the rush of modernization. She organized the senior citizens of Lapuyan, giving older members of the community a platform where their voices could be heard and their needs addressed. Under her guidance, the group did not simply become a social club, but a council of elders whose advice carried weight in community decisions. Her work with the senior citizens was rooted in Subanen tradition. In her culture, elders had always been revered as keepers of wisdom, storytellers, and mediators. But with the growing influence of modern governance, their role risked being diminished. By formalizing their organization, Atitang restored their dignity and influence. She encouraged programs that supported their health, provided them with social activities, and recognized their contributions to cultural preservation. She often said that to care for the elderly was to care for the roots of the community. At the same time, she also deepened her involvement with the Women's Missionary Fellowship, WMF, of the Philippines. Rising through its ranks, she eventually became its national president during the 1960s, leading women across the country in missionary and community work. This was another groundbreaking achievement for a Subanen woman, showing that indigenous voices could lead not only locally, but nationally. She used her platform to highlight the role of women in spreading faith and in sustaining communities through service and prayer. Her dual involvement in senior citizens' welfare and women's fellowship revealed her holistic vision of leadership. She did not limit herself to one demographic. Instead, she sought to uplift every sector of society: children through the PDA, elders through the Senior Citizens Organization, and women through the WMF. Each initiative was interconnected, rooted in her belief that strong communities required strong participation from every generation and gender. Through these roles, she once again broke barriers. She proved that Subanen women could lead not just within tribal structures, but also in organizations that linked them to the wider Philippine society. She gave her people representation in national conversations and ensured that their unique perspective was not lost. For both women and elders, she became a beacon of empowerment. Beyond schools, elders, and women's groups, Atitang also played a vital role in the spiritual leadership of her region. She served as an advisor to churches in the East Zamboanga district, offering guidance to pastors, missionaries, and congregations. Though she did not hold the formal title of pastor, her wisdom and experience made her a sought-after counselor. Leaders often came to her for advice on matters of faith, culture, and community, recognizing her unique ability to balance tradition with the demands of modern Christianity. Her advisory role reflected her deep commitment to the Subanen Church. Having helped translate the Bible and hymns, she now worked to ensure that these tools were used effectively in worship and teaching. She encouraged pastors to preach not only in Tagalog or English, but in Subanen, so that congregations could truly hear the word in their heart language. She reminded churches that faith was strongest when rooted in culture, not when imposed as something foreign. In meetings, she often shared stories and wisdom drawn from her own life, illustrating how Christianity and Subanen identity could coexist. Her voice carried authority, not because of formal ordination, but because of her lived testimony. People respected her for what she had done, for the sacrifices she had made, and for the vision she carried. She was a woman of faith whose leadership was earned through service, humility, and perseverance. Her role as advisor also extended to conflict resolution. When disagreements arose in congregations or communities, she was often called upon to mediate. Her calm presence, combined with her knowledge of both scripture and tradition, allowed her to speak words that heal divisions. She reminded people of their shared faith and their shared heritage, urging unity in the face of challenges. Through her service as advisor, Atitang once again redefined what leadership looked like for Subanen women. She was not confined to the background, but stood as a respected authority in matters of faith and community. In every role she took, whether in education, senior welfare, women's ministry, or church advisory, she blazed trails that others would later follow. She was indeed a woman of firsts, opening doors that had long been closed and ensuring that those who came after her would find the path a little wider and a little brighter. Recognition came to Atitang not because she sought it, but because her life and work left such undeniable impact that others could not ignore it. Over the decades, her leadership in education, cultural preservation, translation, and community development earned her the respect of both local and national institutions. Awards and plaques were presented to her at various times, each one reflecting a different facet of her contributions. One of her earliest official recognitions came in 1972 when the province of Zamboanga del Sur awarded her a plaque of appreciation. The award was symbolic for many reasons. In those days, tribal communities often felt marginalized by provincial governments, their contributions overlooked in favor of lowland leaders and settlers. By awarding her a plaque, the provincial officials acknowledged not only her personal achievements, but also the dignity of the Subanen people she represented. It was a public statement that the Subanen had leaders whose voices deserved to be heard and honored. Later, in 1988, she received one of her most prestigious awards, the Most Outstanding Cultural Minority Award from the Office of Southern Cultural Communities. This was no ordinary recognition. It was an affirmation of her decades of work in ensuring that Subanen culture did not disappear amidst the rush of modernization. The award highlighted her translations of the Bible and hymns, her preservation of epics, and her role as a cultural ambassador for her people. For her, the award was not simply a medal. It was a validation of her mission. She often said that it was not her name she wanted remembered, but the name of her people, whose traditions and language deserved a rightful place in Philippine society. Recognition continued into the 1990s. In 1994, the Provincial Tourism Council honored her with a special token of appreciation, acknowledging her efforts in making Subanen culture accessible to outsiders. By opening her home as a living museum, she had helped tourism not merely become a commercial enterprise, but also an educational journey into the heart of Mindanao's indigenous heritage. Visitors left not only with souvenirs, but with deeper understanding, thanks to her explanations and translations. Each plaque, medallion, or certificate that adorned her walls told a story of perseverance. They were not just awards, but milestones marking the journey of a woman who had bridged two worlds, carrying her people's identity while embracing modernity. As the decades unfolded, the Philippine government and cultural institutions increasingly recognized the importance of indigenous communities in shaping the nation's identity. Tourism councils, universities, and non-governmental organizations turned to leaders like Atitang to provide authentic representations of tribal culture. She became a central figure in this movement, not as a performer of exotic traditions, but as a curator and custodian of living heritage. In 1994, when the Zamboanga del Sur Provincial Tourism Council presented her with a special token of appreciation, it was more than a ceremonial gesture. The award reflected her role in reshaping how outsiders viewed the Subanen. For too long, tribal communities have been romanticized as relics of the past or dismissed as obstacles to progress. Atitang challenged these narratives by showing that Subanen culture was dynamic, vibrant, and compatible with modern faith and education. She insisted that tourism should not reduce her people to spectacles for entertainment, but should instead foster understanding and respect. Visitors who came to her home encountered not stage performances, but genuine hospitality. She explained the meaning of rituals, the significance of artifacts, and the richness of oral literature. She guided tourists, students, and researchers alike in appreciating not only the visible aspects of Subanen life, but also its invisible values: respect for elders, reverence for nature, and the sacredness of community bonds. Through her patient teaching, she turned what could have been shallow tourism into cultural education. Her influence extended beyond Lapuyan. Other towns and provinces began to adopt similar approaches, promoting indigenous culture not as mere curiosity, but as integral to regional identity. In academic circles, she was invited to speak or consulted for cultural programs. Her knowledge enriched conferences, seminars, and even government initiatives aimed at protecting minority groups. By the mid-1990s, she was widely recognized not only as a Subanen leader, but also as a cultural leader for Mindanao as a whole. The awards she received from tourism and cultural organizations carried a deeper meaning for her people. They demonstrated that Subanen traditions, once dismissed as backward, were now being celebrated as treasures of national heritage. Atitang had managed to turn the tide of perception, showing that the jewels of the mountains were not only rivers and forests, but also the songs, stories, and wisdom of its people. Perhaps the recognition closest to her heart came in 1997, when she received the Medallion Trailblazer Award from the Christian and Missionary Alliance Churches of the Philippines, Camakop, and Ebenezer Bible College and Seminary. This award honored her as a pioneer in both faith and leadership, acknowledging her lifelong contributions to the church and to the spread of Christianity among the Subanen. For Atitang, this was not just an accolade. It was a spiritual affirmation that her work had been faithful to the vision she had carried since her youth. The Trailblazer Award recognized her unique role in bringing Christianity into the Subanen heartland. While missionaries had planted the initial seeds, it was leaders like Atitang who ensured that the faith took root in authentic ways. Through her translations, hymns, and leadership, she made sure that Christianity was not an imposed foreign religion, but a lived faith expressed in Subanen language and culture. She blazed trails not only for her people, but also for the church itself, showing that indigenous voices were not peripheral, but central to the growth of the gospel in Mindanao. The award also honored her as an alumna of Ebenezer Bible College, where decades earlier she had been among the first Subanen women to graduate. Her journey from a young student in Zamboanga to a nationally recognized cultural and spiritual leader embodied the very mission of the school: to train leaders who would transform their communities. By awarding her the Trailblazer Medallion, the institution acknowledged that she had fulfilled and exceeded that mission, setting an example for future generations of students, especially women. To her community, the award was a source of pride. It showed that their daughter, sister, and leader was not only respected in Lapuyan, but honored across the nation. For young Subanen women in particular, it was a beacon of possibility. If Atitang could rise from the Dlaman to national recognition, then they too could dream bigger dreams. The Trailblazer Award marked the culmination of a lifetime of service. It did not mark the end of her journey, but celebrated the light she had carried for decades. For Atitang, it was a reminder that blazing trails was never about personal glory, but about opening paths for others to follow. Even as the years weighed on her and her body began to show signs of age, Atitang's mind remained as sharp and determined as ever. In her later years, when many would have rested and enjoyed the quiet dignity of elderhood, she embarked on one of her most ambitious undertakings: the creation of an English Subanen dictionary. For her, this was not a simple academic exercise, but a sacred mission. She had spent her life translating scripture and hymns into her people's tongue, but she knew that for the Subanen language to truly endure, it needed to be preserved in the form of a reference work that could guide future generations. The challenge was monumental. Subanen, like many indigenous languages, was rich in oral expression but lacked standardized spelling or consistent documentation. Words varied from one region to another, and meanings shifted depending on context. To create a dictionary meant listening carefully to elders, recording their words, comparing variants, and deciding on forms that could serve as common standards. It also meant providing English equivalents that captured nuances without flattening the beauty of the original. Day after day, she labored over her notes, her handwriting filling stacks of paper. Visitors to her home would often see her bent over her desk, glasses perched on her nose, as she meticulously cross-referenced terms. She consulted elders, asked questions about forgotten words, and debated with fellow translators about proper spellings. In her heart, she felt the urgency of time. She knew that elders were passing away, taking with them words that had never been written down. She raced against this silence, determined to rescue as many terms as possible before they vanished. The dictionary project was more than language preservation. It was cultural survival. Language, she often said, is the soul of a people. Without it, identity fades. By creating a dictionary, she was giving her people a tool not only to remember, but also to teach, ensuring that young Subanen could learn their mother tongue in schools and that scholars could study it with respect. Though the project remained incomplete at the time of her death, it was a monumental contribution, a beacon that inspired others to continue the work. It showed once again that even in her final years, Atitang remained relentless in her mission, to keep the voice of the Subanen alive. Alongside her dictionary project, Atitang also turned her attention to another unfinished task, the translation of the Old Testament into Subanen. Years earlier, she had poured her heart into the New Testament, completing 24 of its 27 books. That achievement alone would have secured her place in history. But she was not content to stop there. She dreamed of a day when her people could open the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, and read it in their own tongue. The Old Testament, however, posed unique challenges. Its language was often more complex than that of the New Testament, filled with genealogies, laws, and cultural references far removed from Subanen life. Stories of deserts, camels, and temples needed careful rendering for a people whose world revolved around rivers, mountains, and swing fields. Concepts like sacrifice and covenant had to be explained in ways that resonated with indigenous spirituality without distorting their theological meaning. It was a task that required not only linguistic skill, but also theological sensitivity and cultural wisdom. Atitang approached the work with the same devotion that had guided her earlier translations. She spent hours poring over biblical texts, consulting English and Tagalog versions, and then testing her Subanen renderings in community gatherings. She would read passages aloud to elders, listening to their reactions. If a phrase sounded awkward or foreign, she revised it until it flowed like natural speech. Her method was communal, involving her people in the process, ensuring that the translation was not imposed but embraced. Though she did not live to complete the Old Testament, her drafts and notes remain invaluable. They testify to her relentless commitment and her belief that faith must speak in the mother tongue. For her, Scripture was not just about theology, it was about accessibility. The Bible, she argued, should not belong only to pastors or missionaries, but to every grandmother, farmer, and child who wanted to hear God's word in the language of their hearts. Her unfinished Old Testament translations became a legacy of unfinished work. an invitation to others to carry the torch she had lit. In her twilight years, Atitang also became a visionary for cultural preservation on a larger scale. She dreamed of building a Subanen heritage museum, a permanent home where the stories, artifacts, and traditions of her people could be safeguarded for generations to come. Her house had long served as a living museum, but she knew that it was not enough. What was needed was an institution supported by the community and recognized by the nation that would ensure the treasures of Subanen heritage were never lost. Together with groups like the Hidden Jewel of Mindanao Foundation and the Gumpungan Foundation, she began to lay the groundwork for this vision. She shared her ideas with scholars, church leaders, and government officials, painting a picture of a museum that would not only preserve artifacts, but also serve as a center for education, research, and cultural pride. The museum, she insisted, should not be a place of silence, but of life, filled with the sound of Subanen music, the rhythm of chants, and the wisdom of elders teaching the young. Her advocacy was ahead of its time, in an era when indigenous voices were often marginalized. She insisted that Subanen culture deserved the same recognition as the more dominant lowland traditions. She envisioned exhibits of gongs, jars, and woven garments, alongside recordings of epics and hymns. She wanted children to visit the museum and see with their own eyes that their culture was not something to be ashamed of, but something to be proud of. Though she passed away before the museum could be realized, her vision lived on. The foundations she worked with continued to pursue the dream, inspired by her passion. For many, the idea of a Subanen heritage museum became synonymous with her name, a final testimony to her lifelong mission of preservation. She had spent her life collecting words, songs, and objects of memory. Now she sought to give them a permanent home. Her vision for the museum was not just about history. It was about identity, dignity, and the future. It was her final project, the culmination of a lifetime of bridging past and present, ensuring that the Subanen people would always know who they were. Behind the public figure who stood as a leader, translator, and cultural guardian, Atitang was also a mother. Her only daughter, Janie, was both the treasure of her personal life and the living extension of her hopes for the future. Unlike her own upbringing, which had been marked by the tension between tradition and modernity, Janie was raised in a home already shaped by education, faith, and community service. Atitang poured into her daughter the same values she had championed throughout her life: faith in God, respect for heritage, and a commitment to service. Janie grew up in an environment rich with books, hymns, and conversations about culture. She witnessed her mother's tireless dedication to translation work, often falling asleep to the sound of pages turning or to the rhythmic voice of an elder chanting epics in the living room. For Janie, these were not abstractions, but daily realities. She saw in her mother both gentleness and strength, a woman who cared for her family with tenderness while also carrying the burdens of leadership with resilience. Atitang was intentional in guiding her daughter's path. She encouraged Janie to pursue education, ensuring she had access to opportunities that earlier generations of Subanen women could only dream of. Yet she also reminded her never to forget her roots. Whenever Janie faced the lure of lowland or urban life, her mother would tell her stories of Sunglapa, of their ancestors, and of the responsibility they bore as descendants of chiefs. To Atitang, education and heritage were not opposites, but complementary forces, both essential for navigating the complexities of modern life. In time, Janie married engineer Marcelino Hapala Jr., a union that further connected the family to broader circles of influence and opportunity. Atitang welcomed her son-in-law warmly, seeing in him a partner who could help support Janie's own journey, while honoring their Subanen identity. Through this marriage, Atitang's family grew not only in number, but also in reach, as her daughter's life extended the legacy of service into new arenas. For Atitang, Janie was more than a daughter. She was a living reminder that the sacrifices of one generation bore fruit in the next. Every achievement Janie made, every step she took in education and family life, was a reflection of the path her mother had carved through resilience, faith, and vision. The birth of grandchildren marked a new chapter in Atitang's life, one filled with joy, continuity, and renewed purpose. From Janie and Marcelino came 4 grandchildren, each of whom became bearers of the family's expanding legacy. For Atitang, their arrival was not only a source of personal happiness, but also a confirmation that her line, and with it, the values she had fought for, would continue into the future. Her relationship with her grandchildren was tender yet purposeful. She was not the kind of grandmother content to simply dote and spoil. Instead, she saw in each child an opportunity to plant seeds of heritage and faith. She told them stories of their ancestors, weaving into bedtime tales the epics and legends of the Subanen people. She taught them songs, both hymns and folk tunes, ensuring that their ears became attuned to the rhythms of their dual inheritance, Christian faith and tribal identity. In family gatherings, her home echoed with the laughter of children alongside the deep voices of elders. The grandchildren saw firsthand the respect with which visitors treated their grandmother. Scholars, pastors, and government officials all came to seek her counsel, and the children grew up knowing that their grandmother was no ordinary elder, but a woman of stature and vision. This awareness inspired them to carry themselves with dignity, mindful of the responsibility that came with their heritage. Atitang also used these moments to emphasize education. She encouraged her grandchildren to study hard, reminding them of the sacrifices made so that they could attend schools without the barriers she herself had faced. She often told them, "Your learning is not only for yourself, it is for your people." In this way, she passed on not only stories and songs, but also a philosophy of service that would outlive her. For her, the grandchildren were bridges to the future. In them, she saw the blending of Subanen and wider Filipino identities, the merging of ancestral memory with modern possibilities. They were her joy, her hope, and her assurance that the jewel she had guarded throughout her life would continue to shine in the generations to come. While her immediate family was precious to her, Atitang never lost sight of the broader bonds of kinship that defined Subanen life. In her culture, family extended beyond the nuclear unit to encompass clans, relatives by blood and marriage, and even the community itself. As a descendant of chiefs, she bore the responsibility of nurturing these ties, ensuring that relationships were preserved, disputes were mediated, and unity was maintained. Throughout her life, she hosted gatherings that brought together extended family members, often around meals that combined traditional Subanen dishes with influences from neighboring communities. These gatherings were more than social occasions. They were acts of cultural preservation. They reinforced the values of respect for elders, solidarity among kin, and the importance of remembering shared roots. Younger relatives often looked to her for guidance, whether in choosing educational paths, navigating marital challenges, or resolving conflicts. Her advice was valued not only for its wisdom, but also for the love and integrity with which it was given. Her kinship role also extended into leadership. As the wife of a Thimuay Labi and later as a leader in her own right, she was constantly aware that her actions reflected not only on her immediate family, but on the larger Subanen community. She modeled dignity, humility, and service, showing her kin that leadership was not about privilege, but about responsibility. In times of difficulty, she was a unifying figure, reminding her relatives that the strength of the clan lay in its ability to stand together. For Atitang, family was the foundation upon which everything else rested. Her work in translation, education, and cultural preservation drew strength from the support of her kin, and in turn, her accomplishments brought honor to her family. She saw in family life the microcosm of community life, the same values of respect, cooperation, and faith applied to both. As she grew older, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and an extended network of relatives, she often reflected that her greatest legacy was not in awards or titles, but in the bond she had nurtured. Her family, in the broadest sense, was her living monument, a testament to the truth that culture and faith endure not only in institutions and books, but in the love that binds generations together. As Atitang entered her later years, her hair turned silver and her steps slowed, but her spirit remained unyielding. For the Subanen, old age was not seen as decline, but as the flowering of wisdom. And in her case, this wisdom was unmatched. Visitors often remarked how her presence filled a room, not through volume or authority alone, but through the calm dignity she carried in her every gesture. Her voice, though softened by age, retained the eloquence that had once charmed missionaries, dignitaries, and scholars. She no longer moved as quickly as she once had, but her words continued to travel far, shaping the hearts and minds of those around her. In those years, she lived in Lapuyan surrounded by her family, yet her home remained open to the community. Young people came to her for advice, scholars came to learn from her, and church leaders sought her counsel. She was no longer the young woman who had translated hymns late into the night or recorded epics with tireless energy, but she still offered her guidance with clarity and conviction. To those who visited, her home felt like a sanctuary, a place where the past and present met, where wisdom flowed like a river, and where the burdens of leadership were lightened by her reassuring presence. Despite her age, she continued to work on her projects. The dictionary drafts filled her desk, and the Old Testament translations remained spread across her table. She often reminded her family that the work of preservation could not wait. Every day, she said, words are disappearing. If we do not write them, they will vanish. Even when her eyesight began to weaken, she dictated notes to helpers, unwilling to let the passage of time rob her of her mission. Her resilience inspired those around her. Many elders retreat into silence in their final years, but she leaned deeper into service. She demonstrated that leadership had no expiration, that as long as one could speak, teach, and encourage, one could lead. In her old age, she embodied the Subanen ideal of the elder as a living library of memory and wisdom. She had spent her youth as a pioneer, her middle years as a leader, and her final years as a sage, a seamless arc of service that reflected the fullness of her life. One of the defining features of Atitang's later years was her determination to pass the torch to the next generation. She understood that no matter how much she achieved, her work would remain incomplete if there were no one to continue it. Thus, she invested her final energies in mentoring others, her daughter, her grandchildren, her community's young leaders, and even visiting scholars who sought to preserve Subanen culture. She emphasized continuity in every conversation. To her daughter Janie, she stressed the importance of family leadership, not only in managing household responsibilities, but in upholding their role as descendants of chiefs. She reminded her that being a leader was less about titles and more about embodying values, humility, service, and courage. To her grandchildren, she became a storyteller, impressing upon them the richness of their heritage. She told them, "Never be ashamed of being Subanen. Our language, our songs, our stories, they're treasures greater than gold." Beyond her family, she nurtured younger members of the community. She identified those with talent in singing, teaching, or leadership and encouraged them to develop their gifts. She urged them to pursue education, reminding them that knowledge was a shield against exploitation and a bridge to wider opportunities. Yet she always anchored her advice in culture, insisting that education must never come at the cost of forgetting one's roots. Many of these young people would later become teachers, pastors, and cultural workers, carrying forward the values she instilled. Her mentorship also extended to partnerships with organizations. As a consultant for cultural affairs at the Hidden Jewel of Mindanao Foundation and a trustee of the Gampangan Foundation, she shared her vision of a Subanen heritage that was not static but evolving. She challenged these groups to prioritize indigenous voices, to let the Subanen themselves define how their culture was to be preserved and presented. By engaging both local and external institutions, she created a network of allies committed to sustaining her mission. Passing the torch was not an easy process. She sometimes worried whether the next generation had the same perseverance to face the struggles she had endured. But her faith reassured her. She believed that the God who had sustained her through trials would also raise up others to continue the work. With this conviction, she poured out her final strength, confident that her legacy would not die with her, but live on in those she had prepared. The final chapter of Atitang's life came quietly on March 11th, 2002. She passed away surrounded by her family, leaving behind not a void, but a legacy that seemed to reverberate through every corner of Lapuyan and beyond. For days, the community mourned. Their grief mingled with deep gratitude. Elders spoke of her as the bridge between generations. Scholars remembered her as a cultural authority, and church leaders honored her as a faithful servant of God. Her departure felt like the closing of a great book, yet one whose pages would be read again and again by those who followed. Her funeral was a gathering unlike any other. Relatives, neighbors, church members, and officials came together, each bringing their own memories of how she had touched their lives. Hymns were sung in Subanen, echoing the translation she had labored over decades earlier. Speeches were made in English, Tagalog, and Subanen, reflecting the three worlds she had woven together throughout her life. Her coffin was surrounded by flowers, artifacts, and books, a fitting tribute to a woman who had devoted her life to preserving beauty, memory, and faith. For her family, the loss was deeply personal. Janie mourned not only the passing of a mother, but the departure of a mentor, a guide, and a friend. Her grandchildren felt the ache of absence, but also the pride of inheritance, knowing that the stories she had told and the values she had instilled would remain with them forever. For the Subanen people, her death marked the passing of an era. They had lost not just a leader, but a living embodiment of their culture and resilience. Yet even in death, her presence remained palpable. The books she translated continued to be read in churches. The hymns she composed were sung by congregations. The epics she preserved were studied in universities. And the vision she carried for a museum and a dictionary lingered as unfinished tasks, calling others to take them up. In this way, she lived on, not only in memory, but in every song, every prayer, every story that bore her imprint. March 11th, 2002 was not the end, but a transition. For those who knew her, it was the day when the jewel of the Subanen was returned to the earth, her light no longer shining in flesh, but reflected in the countless lives she had touched. When the news of Atitang's passing spread across Lapuyan and the surrounding mountains, elders gathered to share memories of her life. For the Subanen, oral testimonies are not merely recollections. They are sacred acts of remembrance, binding the present to the past. Around fires, in churches, and at family gatherings, stories of her journey were told again and again, each one highlighting a different facet of her character and contributions. These oral narratives became the first foundation of her legacy. Elders recalled the days when she, as a young girl, would run to the missionary's house, eager to wash dishes in exchange for lessons. They spoke of her determination in school, her role as valedictorian, and the heartbreak when her scholarship to study nursing was denied. Yet they always emphasized how that disappointment became a blessing, redirecting her toward translation and leadership. In these retellings, her life was framed as a narrative of resilience. Obstacles turned into opportunities, setbacks transformed into stepping stones. They also remembered her voice, both in song and in speech. Many recalled how she could chant an epic in the Subanen tongue one moment and then stand before missionaries or government officials the next, translating with perfect eloquence. Her ability to move between worlds was seen as a gift from the ancestors and from God, a sign that she had been chosen to carry her people's story into the future. Elders often described her as the mouth of the Subanen, the one who gave language to their dignity in places where they were often silenced. Her work of preservation was also a recurring theme in these testimonies. Elders acknowledged that without her translations, many epics might have disappeared forever. They recognized her home as a sanctuary where artifacts and stories were safe, where young people could see what it meant to be Subanen. For them, her life was not just history, but continuity. She had ensured that the chain of memory would not be broken. In these oral testimonies, Atitang was not remembered as a distant figure of authority, but as a relative, a mentor, a sister, and a mother to her people. Her story lived on, not only in the pages of books and the plaques of recognition, but in the living voices of her community, who carried her memory as part of their own identity. While the community honored her through oral tradition, scholars and institutions also recognized the enduring significance of her work. Universities that had partnered with her, such as Xavier University and the University of the Philippines, continued to study the materials she had preserved. Linguists cited her recordings of Dlamimbe, Pagaslungan as unparalleled contributions to the study of oral literature. Anthropologists pointed to her translations as examples of how indigenous voices could shape rather than merely be shaped by academic research. For these scholars, Atitang was not merely an informant, but a co-creator of knowledge. Foundations like the Hidden Jewel of Mindanao Foundation and the Gumpungan Foundation carried forward the projects she had envisioned. They kept alive her dream of a Subanen Heritage Museum, advocating for a space where artifacts, manuscripts, and recordings could be permanently housed. They also used her notes and translations as resources for educational programs, teaching younger generations the value of their heritage. Through these institutions, her influence extended far beyond her lifetime, continuing to inspire cultural preservation efforts across Mindanao. Her recognition also spread through church networks. The Christian and Missionary Alliance of the Philippines, CAMACOP, remembered her as one of their most outstanding leaders, a woman who had carried the gospel into her people's language and life. Her Trailblazer Award remained a symbol of her pioneering spirit, inspiring new generations of church workers to see indigenous culture not as an obstacle, but as a channel for faith. For scholars and foundations alike, her legacy was twofold. On one hand, She preserved the Subanen's intangible heritage, their language, their songs, their stories. On the other, she embodied a model of partnership, showing how indigenous leaders and outside institutions could work together respectfully. She demanded that the Subanen not be treated as mere subjects of study, but as active participants in shaping their narrative. This insistence on dignity set a standard for future collaborations, reminding researchers that true preservation comes not from extraction, but from empowerment. Through these ongoing works, Atitang remained alive in academic circles, church fellowships, and cultural foundations. Her name became synonymous with Subanen identity, and her contributions became case studies in how one woman could bridge the gap between local heritage and global recognition. Perhaps the greatest legacy Atitang left behind was the way she seamlessly wove together faith, culture, and leadership. To some, these elements might seem at odds. Faith rooted in biblical Christianity, culture grounded in ancestral traditions, and leadership exercised in both tribal and civic arenas. Yet for Atitang, these were not contradictions, but harmonies, different strands of a single tapestry that defined her life. Her faith was deep and unwavering. From the time she first learned hymns in the missionary house to her final days working on Bible translations, she saw Christianity not as a foreign imposition, but as a personal conviction. Yet, unlike many who equated conversion with abandoning tradition, she insisted that faith must enrich culture, not erase it. She sang hymns in Subanen, translated scriptures in her people's language, and reminded churches that worship in the mother tongue was both biblical and beautiful. In this way, she modeled a Christianity that was not colonial, but contextual, deeply rooted in her people's identity. Her cultural leadership was equally profound. She did not simply preserve artifacts or record epics as relics of the past. She treated them as living expressions of identity. She reminded her community that their stories were not inferior to those of other nations, that their songs were not less sacred, and that their traditions carried wisdom that could stand alongside modern education. Through her work, she showed that preserving culture was not nostalgia, it was survival. It was about giving future generations the tools to know who they were and where they came from. As a leader, she broke barriers for women, elders, and indigenous people alike. She became the first woman PDA president in Lapuyan, the national president of the Women's Missionary Fellowship, and an advisor to churches. She represented her people with dignity in settings where they were often marginalized. Yet she always led with humility, insisting that leadership was not about recognition, but about service. Together, these three strands, faith, culture, leadership, formed the enduring legacy of her life. She showed that one could be a Christian without ceasing to be Subanen, that one could embrace education without abandoning tradition, and that one could lead as a woman without diminishing her femininity. Her life was a testimony that harmony was possible, and in this harmony lay the strength of her people. Atitang Imbing Huminis' story is best understood as the life of a woman who stood between two worlds and found a way to bridge them. On one side was the ancient Subanen heritage, the chants of the epics, the rhythm of the bucklog, the wisdom of elders, and the sacred ties to land and kinship. On the other side was the new world brought by missionaries, schools, and modern governance. A world of printed books, translated hymns, civic leadership, and Christian faith. Many in her time feared that these two worlds could not coexist, that to embrace the new meant abandoning the old. Yet through her courage, vision, and labor, Atitang proved that it was possible to weave the two together into something strong and enduring. Her translations embodied this bridging work. Every verse of the New Testament she rendered into Subanen was both an act of faith and an act of cultural affirmation. Every hymn she set to her people's tongue was a declaration that Christianity could sound like home. Likewise, her preservation of epics affirmed that ancestral memory need not vanish in the face of modernity. Instead, it could stand alongside the Bible, each illuminating different dimensions of the human spirit. By refusing to choose one over the other, she created a harmony that allowed her people to move forward without losing their roots. Her marriage and leadership roles extended this bridging mission into the political and social realms. As wife of a mayor in Thimuay Libun, she stood with dignity in civic halls where Subanen voices were rarely heard. As First Lady of Lapuyan, she showed that women could lead not from the margins, but from the center. Her work with the PDA, the Senior Citizens Organization, and the Women's Missionary Fellowship demonstrated her ability to navigate modern institutions while bringing with her the values of her people. In all these roles, she was not merely a participant, but a pioneer. She entered spaces where few Subanen, especially women, had gone before, and she left them transformed. Her life was not only about bridging two worlds, but also about blazing new paths between them, making sure that others could follow. In this way, she lived not as a divided woman, but as a unifier, carrying both heritage and modernity in her heart with equal devotion. Beyond her accomplishments, Atitang became a symbol of what it meant to be a woman of faith in her time and culture. Traditionally, Subanen women have been respected, but often confined to domestic spaces. Their influence felt quietly within families rather than in public arenas. Atitang disrupted this pattern, not by rejecting womanhood, but by redefining it. She showed that a woman could be both a nurturer of family and a leader of communities, both a keeper of tradition and a pioneer of change. Her womanhood was expressed in the tenderness with which she raised her daughter and grandchildren, in the patience with which she embroidered and taught younger girls, and in the grace with which she hosted dignitaries and scholars. Yet it was equally expressed in her strength, standing before councils, advising churches, and translating works that demanded intellectual rigor and perseverance. She embodied a balance of gentleness and authority, humility and confidence, qualities that made her an exemplar not only for Subanen women, but for all women navigating cultural expectations. Her faith was the anchor that held these dimensions together. Christianity, for her, was not an abstract theology, but a living reality. She prayed in Subanen, sang hymns she herself had translated, and lived by the scripture she had labored to render into her people's language. Her leadership was never about power for its own sake. It was about service, modeled after Christ's example of humility and sacrifice. For this reason, both men and women respected her. She did not demand authority. It flowed naturally from her integrity and her faith. In many ways, she became the embodiment of Proverbs 31's woman of noble character, though in a distinctly Subanen form. Her worth was found not in wealth or titles, but in the lives she touched, the culture she preserved, and the faith she nurtured. To the Subanen, she was not just a leader, but a mother of the people. To the church, she was not just a translator, but a trailblazer of indigenous faith. To women across Mindanao, she was not just an exception, but an inspiration, a proof that womanhood and leadership, tradition and faith could flourish together. More than 2 decades after her passing, the memory of Atitang continues to shine, like a jewel that catches the light and reflects it in many directions. Her legacy lives on in the hymns sung every Sunday in Subanen churches, in the scriptures read in their mother tongue, and in the epics studied by scholars who marvel at their complexity. Her influence is felt in the classrooms of Lapuyan, where children still benefit from the educational initiatives she once championed, and in the gatherings of elders and women's groups that she helped to organize. Her story endures because it is more than personal, it is collective. She carried her people's voice into spaces where it might have been silenced. And in doing so, she made space for future generations to speak. Every Subanen child who reads a Bible verse in their own language, every elder who hears their epic preserved in writing, and every woman who dares to lead in church or community carries a spark of her legacy. The symbol of the jewel is fitting. A jewel is not formed overnight. It is shaped under pressure, refined through time, and valued because of its rarity and brilliance. So it was with Atitang. She endured the pressures of tradition and modernity, refined her gifts through decades of labor, and emerged as a rare and brilliant leader whose value extended far beyond her immediate community. Like a jewel, she reflected light, faith, culture, and dignity that illuminated not only her people, but also those who encountered her from outside. Today, when Subanen elders speak of her, they do so with reverence, calling her Thimuay Libun not only by title, but with affection. When scholars cite her work, they acknowledge her as a co-architect of cultural preservation. When churches remember her, they honor her as a pioneer of indigenous faith. And when her family recalls her life, they cherish her as a mother and grandmother whose love anchored everything she did. The enduring light of Atitang reminds us that true leadership is not about monuments or fame, but about service that transcends time. She was, and remains, the jewel of the Subanen, shining in memory, in legacy, and in the hearts of those who continue to walk the path she first illuminated.